It was the smell of wood shavings that hit me first, a sharp, earthy scent, the kind that lingers in the air of a workshop. It was strong and oddly sweet, like fresh wood cut with something richer, darker. That was what drew me into the shop in the first place. I had been wandering through the narrow streets of the old town, a place I hadn't visited in years. The town hadn't changed much, not really, though in my absence it had acquired a weathered, almost forgotten look. It felt smaller, quieter, its edges gnawed away by time. I had no plans for that day, no destination, no expectations, just the desire to walk and escape the suffocating weight of my thoughts. And that's when I saw it, a small shop tucked between two crumbling brick buildings, its wooden sign swaying slightly in the breeze. "The Dollmaker," the sign read, etched in delicate looping script. Simple, but enough to stop me in my tracks. I don't know what it was that made me pause. I've never liked dolls, not even as a child, but something about this place seemed to pull me in. The window was dusty, the glass smudged and grimy, but I could make out the faint outline of porcelain faces through the gloom. Their unblinking eyes stared back at me, unsettlingly lifelike, their small hands posed as if frozen mid-gesture. It was as though they were waiting, watching. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed open the door. A small bell above it jingled, its sound swallowed quickly by the thick, oppressive silence inside. The smell hit me harder now. Wood, varnish, and that sweet undertone I couldn't quite place. The shop was dimly lit, the air thick with dust motes that swirled lazily in the weak light of the scattered lamps. Shelves lined the walls, every inch of them covered in dolls, not the cheap plastic kind you'd find in a toy store, but antique dolls, crafted with a care and precision that spoke of another era. They stared at me, their glass eyes gleaming in the half-light, their porcelain faces frozen in expressions of serene innocence, or something close to it. Some wore delicate lace dresses, their hair made of silk or real human strands, their lips painted in soft smiles. Others wore tiny suits or sailor outfits, their limbs positioned just so, as if waiting for someone to breathe life into them. A shiver ran down my spine, and I nearly turned to leave. But something held me there. Something in the way the dolls seemed to follow my movements, their unblinking eyes tracking me as I moved deeper into the shop. That's when I saw him. He was sitting at a workbench at the back of the shop, hunched over a block of wood. His hands, large and calloused, worked with a precision that seemed impossible for such a burly man. His fingers moved with delicate grace, shaping the wood into the delicate form of a doll's arm. I hadn't noticed him at first, hidden as he was behind a wall of half-finished dolls. He was so still, so focused, that I might have thought him one of his own creations. "Can I help you?" His voice was deep, gravelly, and it startled me. I hadn't expected him to speak, hadn't expected anyone to be there at all. "I was just looking," I stammered, feeling foolish. What was I doing in a doll shop? I didn't even like dolls. He looked up, and I met his eyes. They were dark, nearly black, and there was something in them that made me uneasy. Not malice exactly, but something colder, harder. His gaze was penetrating, like he could see through me, into the very marrow of my bones. "They're beautiful," I said, gesturing vaguely to the shelves of dolls. "You made all of these?" A small smile tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I did," he said, his hands never stopping their work. "They're so lifelike," I continued, stepping closer to the counter. "I've never seen anything like them." He nodded, his attention now fully on the doll he was working on. I watched him carve, the blade moving with practiced ease, shaping the wood into the slender curve of an arm. It was mesmerizing, in a way. There was a strange grace to his movements, a calm precision that made it impossible to look away. After a few moments, he set down his tools and looked up at me again. "Would you like one?" he asked, his voice smooth and low. "A doll?" I blinked, caught off guard. "I can make one for you. Custom. A perfect likeness." His smile widened slightly, though it still didn't reach his eyes. No, I started to say, the sensible part of me recoiling at the idea. But the words died in my throat, swallowed by the strange pull I felt toward the man, toward the dolls. "How much?" He named a price, one that was absurdly high for a doll, but I found myself nodding, agreeing to it without hesitation. I felt like I was in a trance, my mind foggy, my body moving of its own accord. "When can I pick it up?" "Come back in 3 days," he said, already turning back to his work. "It will be ready." I left the shop in a daze, my feet carrying me through the streets, though I couldn't have told you how I got back to my apartment. That night, I dreamt of dolls. Their glassy eyes stared at me, unblinking, their small hands reaching out to grasp at my clothes, my hair. In the dream, the dollmaker stood behind them, watching, always watching. When I woke, I could still feel the weight of their eyes on me, and a cold sweat clung to my skin. For the next 3 days, I tried to push the shop out of my mind, but the pull was too strong. I couldn't stop thinking about the doll, about what it would look like, what it would feel like in my hands. And behind every thought, every waking moment, I could feel the dollmaker's eyes, sharp and dark, as though he was still watching me, even from afar. When the 3rd day came, I found myself standing outside the shop once again. The sign creaked in the wind, and the windows were as grimy as ever. But the light inside was on, casting a dim glow across the rows of dolls. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and the smell of wood and varnish hit me once more. The dollmaker was behind the counter, just as before, and in front of him was the doll. My doll. It was exquisite. The porcelain skin was flawless, pale and smooth, the glass eyes a perfect shade of blue. Its hair, dark and silky, was arranged in delicate curls, and the dress, lace and satin, was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. But it wasn't just the beauty of the doll that stopped me in my tracks. It was the fact that it looked like me. Not an exact replica, but close enough to make my heart skip a beat. The shape of the face, the curve of the lips, the tilt of the head, it was unmistakable. "She's perfect, isn't she?" the dollmaker said, his voice soft, almost reverent. I couldn't speak. My throat had gone dry, and all I could do was nod. He smiled that cold, distant smile and pushed the doll toward me. "Take her." I hesitated, but my hands moved on their own, reaching out to lift the doll from the counter. It was heavier than I expected, its porcelain skin cold against my hands. The weight of it felt wrong somehow, unnatural, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. "Take good care of her," the dollmaker said, his voice low and smooth. "She belongs to you now." I left the shop in a daze, the doll cradled in my arms. It felt like I was carrying a piece of myself, a small, fragile version of who I was, or who I had been. I placed the doll on the shelf in my living room, its glass eyes staring straight ahead, unblinking. But no matter where I went, no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I could feel its eyes on me, following me. That night I dreamt of the dollmaker again, but this time the dream was different. In this dream, he was in my apartment, standing over my bed, his dark eyes gleaming in the shadows. His hands, those large, calloused hands, were covered in blood, the crimson staining his fingers as he worked on something in the darkness. I tried to move, to speak, but my body wouldn't obey. All I could do was watch as he leaned closer, his breath hot against my skin. "She belongs to me," he whispered, his voice like ice. "You belong to me." I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the air thick with the smell of wood and varnish. I glanced toward the shelf, and my breath caught in my throat. The doll was gone. I searched the apartment, my pulse racing, but there was no sign of it. The shelf where I had left it was empty. The shelf where I had left it was empty. The space where it had sat, now vacant. My pulse quickened, panic setting in. I searched the room, every corner, every dark crevice, but the doll was nowhere to be found. I tried to tell myself I had misplaced it, that I had moved it during the night without realizing, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The doll was gone, and with it, a piece of me had disappeared as well. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the old building sent shivers down my spine. I kept looking toward the empty shelf, half expecting the doll to reappear, its glassy eyes fixed on me once more. Morning came, and with it, a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I avoided my apartment as much as possible, spending hours walking the streets, trying to outrun the feeling of being watched. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I walked, I couldn't escape the weight of the doll's absence. And then, 2 days after the doll had disappeared, I found it. I had come home late, my nerves frayed from lack of sleep, my body heavy with exhaustion. The apartment was dark when I entered, the silence oppressive. As I fumbled for the light switch, I felt something cold brush against my hand. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head. There, sitting on the floor by the door, was the doll. Its glassy eyes gleamed in the faint light from the hallway, its porcelain face tilted ever so slightly to the side, as if it were watching me, waiting for me. I backed away, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing in the apartment. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. I was trapped. The doll remained still, its eyes never leaving mine. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A voice, low, cold, and unmistakably familiar. "She belongs to me," the voice whispered. The Dollmaker's voice. My blood ran cold. I stumbled backward, my hands fumbling for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The doll moved then, slowly, its head turning ever so slightly, its glassy eyes following me as I backed away. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, let me go." But the doll didn't respond. Instead, it rose to its feet, its small porcelain limbs moving with a grace that was both delicate and unnatural. It took a step toward me, and then another, its movement slow and deliberate. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nowhere to go. The doll was closing in, its cold, lifeless eyes fixed on mine. And then, just as it reached me, everything went dark. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of my apartment, the faint light of dawn filtering through the curtains. The doll was gone, and the apartment was silent. I sat up slowly, my body aching, my mind foggy with confusion. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and stress? I didn't know. But as I looked around the room, something caught my eye. There, on the shelf where the doll had once sat, was a new one. This doll was different. Its face was familiar, its eyes a deep glassy blue, its hair dark and silky, fell in delicate curls around its porcelain face. But it wasn't just any doll. It was me. I stared at it, my mind reeling. How? How could this be possible? I reached out to touch the doll, my fingers trembling as they brushed against its cold porcelain skin. The resemblance was uncanny. It wasn't just a doll that looked like me. It was me. Every detail, every flaw, every feature was perfectly replicated. And then, as I stared into its glassy eyes, I felt it. A pull. A connection. I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. My fingers were frozen in place, locked onto the doll's porcelain skin. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The Dollmaker hadn't just created a doll. He had taken something from me. My essence, my soul, whatever you want to call it. It was in the doll now, trapped in those lifeless glass eyes. And as I stared into them, I knew that I wasn't free. I never would be. I belonged to him. In the days that followed, I tried to leave the apartment, to escape the pull of the doll, but I couldn't. Every time I stepped outside, I felt the weight of its presence, drawing me back. No matter how far I went, I was always pulled back to the apartment, back to the doll. And each time I returned, it was waiting for me, its glassy eyes watching, its porcelain hands poised, ready to claim me. I became a prisoner in my own home, trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and dread. The doll's presence grew stronger with each passing day, its pull more powerful, more irresistible. And then, one night, the Dollmaker returned. I woke to find him standing at the foot of my bed, his dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, and in that moment, I knew. It was over. I was his. The doll was sitting on the nightstand, its glassy eyes fixed on me, its porcelain face serene. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and as my fingers touched its cold skin, I felt the last of my will slip away. The Dollmaker smiled, a cold, cruel smile, and whispered the words I had been dreading. You belong to me.